It's good to be here today to launch the new Countering Fraud Guide for the charity sector, a sector which probably more than any other deserves proper protection against fraud, because the damage that's done when fraud takes place and the resources aren't deployed for charitable purposes. So we've worked with lots of different people in the charity sector to try and make sure this guide is as good as possible in terms of providing advice for charities to protect themselves against fraud taking place. But I think it's good to actually go back and just think a little bit about why fraud is important. Across society as a whole, it means that private companies are less financially stable and healthy than they would otherwise be. It means that public sector organisations can't provide the quality of public services that we pay our taxes to get. But crucially in the charity sector, it means that there's an extra cost for charities and there are less resources than there should be to actually deliver on charitable purposes. And that's an economic and financial cost. There are various types of fraud that affect charities, and I've listed some on the slide, whether it's donations going astray to bogus collectors or charities that don't actually exist, whether it's internal staff fraud or fraud affecting some of the major areas of expenditure, such as procurement fraud, payroll fraud, and indeed grant expenditure. But in a way, we need to look more broadly than that. That's kind of known types of fraud against charities. And we need to understand that fraud is a continuously evolving and changing, extremely dynamic phenomenon. So if we just look at types of fraud that have already taken place and merely rely on controls in those areas, we are not doing enough. We need to think about how the threat is evolving and how we may be impacted by it. How much does fraud cost? Well, the latest annual fraud indicator, that was a piece of research actually produced by PKF Littlejohn and the University of Portsmouth in association with Experian. The estimate from that was 1.9 billion in the charity sector. Now, compared to some of the other sectors, the private sector impacted to the extent of 144 billion, public sector 37.5 billion, 1.9 billion is relatively low, but that is still an awful lot of money not being spent as intended on delivering on charitable purposes. This is not a marginal issue for the sector. This is an important issue where extra resources can be made available if we can reduce that cost. And indeed, the bad news is the amount that's being lost. The good news is that there are examples in the charity sector and beyond of where organisations have successfully cut the cost of fraud by up to 40% within 12 months and by over 50% over a longer period. So if we apply that to the 1.9 billion, if that was repeated by organisations across the charity sector, potentially that means £760 million of additional resources for charitable purposes. So enormous positive financial benefits from actually tackling this problem effectively, properly protecting ourselves against fraud, minimising the cost of fraud. But those are the numbers really across the sector. If we look at what individual organisations might suffer, PKF Littlejohn, together with the University of Portsmouth, manage the largest database in the world around the measured cost of fraud. That's measuring that cost to defined levels of accuracy and statistical confidence. And 17 years of data, many different countries, 40 different sectors. The running average is 5.6% of expenditure going astray to fraud. And that's a significant amount in any organisation of any size. The spectrum or range of costs goes up to over 22%. And I myself have done work for one organisation which was losing 18.7% of 250 million each year. So enormous losses, money not going to be spent where it was intended. So all of that comes together really with this guide. We've analysed the nature and scale of fraud in the charity sector. Last October at the Charity Commission Conference on Fraud, we published the latest data on how well charities in England and Wales protect themselves against fraud. This guide brings all of that together with some guidance to help charities reduce the cost of fraud and better protect themselves. And what I'd like to do is to really take you through some of the key points in the report, if you like, top 10 tips First of all, not doing anything, you have to actually, action is a must. Don't do nothing. That's crucial. Don't just hope it's not going to happen. It will be happening in any charity of any size, mostly high volume, low value, but it will be happening and you need to have proper protection in place. Secondly, understand what fraud is and isn't. It's not just a catch-all word for all sorts of dishonesty-related phenomena. So fraud is a specific problem with a specific solution. Thirdly, concentrate on the financial and reputational cost of fraud. And that's where the damage is really greatest. And also focus on the outcomes, the positive outcomes that your charity can actually derive from counter-fraud work. It's not just about activity, it's about achieving a beneficial impact, a positive impact for your charity. Setting the right tone from the top is important. Making sure that from the most senior levels in your charity there's an understanding about the problem and there is a clear tone coming to those that work for or with your charity that fraud is wrong and has a negative impact on that charity. It's also important to remember that preempting fraud is much better than reacting. You have to react when fraud happens, but what you need to do is to preempt fraud as much as possible. And the more you do to preempt fraud, the less you have to do to react. Make sure you have access to the right skills. The last 15 years has seen the development in the UK of a counter-fraud profession. And there are now 14,000 people accredited at foundation, diploma, degree and master's levels in this country with just the right skill set to counter fraud. That doesn't necessarily mean having somebody full-time or even part-time in your charity, but it does mean having access to the right skill set to be able to protect you effectively. Understand the importance of a real anti-fraud culture and deterrent effect, not just warm words, but by a real anti-fraud culture, I mean a charity where the honest majority, and there always is one, the honest majority is mobilised and active in defending the charity against fraud. And also a deterrent effect where the dishonest minority, and there always is one, is actually minimised and deterred. Final two key points. Highlight the financial benefits of reducing the cost of fraud. Counter-fraud work isn't just about the avoidance of something negative, it's about actually achieving something positive, delivering additional resources to make your charity more effective. And finally, make sure that you performance manage counter-fraud work. You're clear about what you want to achieve as a result of working in this area, and you actually measure the extent to which you are achieving what you want to achieve. So in conclusion, I think it's true to say that fraud isn't just a reputational risk. There is a significant hidden financial cost. It's mostly high volume, low value, which makes it hard to detect, so much better to preempt fraud. We know, I think, over the last 15 years, an awful lot more about the nature of the problem and what works to actually reduce the extent of that problem. What I'm very pleased about this guide is it brings together all of that knowledge to provide advice and guidance for charities about how they can protect themselves better in future. Thank you.